Okay, so the final bone of the arm that we're going to look at is the radius. Radius being more or less the same proportion as the ulnar, like we mentioned before, just a little bit shorter because it doesn't have that overlap through there. It doesn't have that kung fu claw grip on the humerus that the ulnar has. So why have two forearm bones? Well, not all animals do, right? The only animals that will have two distinct forearm bones are ones that need to pronate and supinate. That is, to rotate the wrist from pointing up to pointing down. So if you look at a horse, it doesn't have that relationship, doesn't have a radius that rotates around the ulnar, whereas we do, because that rotation movement is super important to us. So I'm going to cheat here and make my make my radius out of my ulnar. So here I'm just going to take it and move it across. And as we look into the radius, what we're going to discover is that this bone is all about the rotation. That's why if you're an animal that doesn't rotate, that doesn't need to go from palm up to palm down, for example, you don't need a radius. If you're listening to this tutorial, you probably are an animal that needs to rotate, so you will have a radius, and that radius will be thin at the top, and it will be articulating with this sphere shape, the capitulum that we looked at on the humerus, that bad boy there. And so if you look at the top of your radius, what you're going to see is basically like a cigarette tray. Right, something like this. Thing about the top of the radius is it's not necessarily following our rule of you find bones at either end. Right, the radius you can't find at this end, even though it's vital to the function of the human body because it has that articulation there. You can't find it there. The radius, it doesn't have like any area that is a true bony landmark, but what's important is that it's doing the opposite of the ulnar, right? Whereas the ulnar is big at the top and small at the bottom, and I feel like on the ulnar actually I can push that smallness at the bottom even more. On the radius, it's small at the top and big at the bottom, right? So it's inverting that. So let's say like 70 to 80% of the width of the wrist is coming from the radius. Now at the moment I've got these bones touching. There is a gap between them in real life, but you really don't need to worry about that. You know, when I'm teaching écorché, I'm always getting the students to make them together as one unit, because it's fiddly as hell to sculpt these as two separate things, but also because, you know, you can just think of them as one unit, and at least in terms of when you're constructing the form. When you're thinking about the movement of it, God knows you don't want to be thinking about that as one unit, because that'll stop you thinking about what the radius is actually doing. So now that we have something like a radius there, I want to put in a bone quickly through here and show you, if I can, what the anticipated movement is going to be. So it's articulating up there, and is this going to work? This is going from supination to pronation. I think I need to figure out where I should put that bone. The end result is going to be that, right? Boom. We go from that, spin around the ulnar, cross over the ulnar through there. So when your palm is down, that's what's happening in your radius. When your palm is up, bonk, it's that. So spinning around the ulnar. Vital, right, to understand that. So the ulnar is not spinning at all. The ulnar is only a hinge. The radius is not a hinge. Of course, when the ulnar hinges, the radius moves with it. These bones are joined in that way. But when you're going from palm up to palm down, that's all in the radius and it's not in the ulnar. As we get down here, all I want you to look at is basically like how boxy this form is through here. And when we start to put flesh on this, what you'll see is the wrist area, like from this point downwards, maybe even higher than that, at least on the outside of the arm, the muscles are turning to tendon. And tendon doesn't have the same level of mass as muscles, meaning that when you're looking at this area of the forearm, nearly all of the description of form that you're working with is bone, tendon, and skin. And it doesn't matter how muscular you are, you can't grow your bones, tendons, and skin. Well, you could grow your bone by calcifying it, right? If you want to grow your bones, keep on smacking them with a hammer and they'll eventually get bigger. But for most of us, we're not going to do that. So for most of us, we will maintain the same thickness of our wrists throughout our lives. right? If you break your arm, that's another way, right? It'll calcify and it'll get bigger. But I feel like that's not really what I need to be talking about here. So yeah, all I want you to do is look for the boxiness of the radius as it gets to the bottom. Look for how the majority of the wrist is the width of the radius. And if you're feeling really smart, you can just look at how the radius kind of hooks around the wrist, and then if you're feeling super smart, when we look at the legs, you can go, the leg has that same connection, but so the equivalent would be in the fibula, but that comes around much more to protect the joint because we're carrying weight on the joint, whereas here we don't need so much protection. So yeah, sure, if you want to be clever about it, then think about that stuff. If you're not so clever, then just go thin at the top, big at the bottom. This is like an ashtray, so we have a kind of ball and socket joint through there, and then through here, this is basically like a box, and that's your radius and ulna. One head for the radius, one head and a bit for the ulna, because it's crossing over through there, 1.5 heads for the humerus, bony landmarks of the ulna being here and here, the whole body of the ulna being visible, however, in life. Radius not having any true bony landmarks, but down here, it's defining most of the mass of the wrist.